Hi, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you may be. Welcome back to Enrollment RX's webinar series, Reaching New Heights on Salesforce for Admissions. This is our final ninth webinar session where the topic is going to be preparing a future-proof implementation and deployment of Salesforce for admissions. My name is Lawrence Levy. I'm the president of Enrollment RX. We're a Salesforce partner since 2008, focused on software solutions for recruitment and admissions on the platform. I'm thrilled to be joined by my colleague as well, Kathy Kojigante. Kathy, please tell us about yourself.
All right, so good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. Thank you very much for taking the time to join our webinar today. My name is Kathy Kojigante. I am the Director of Implementation Services here at Enrollment RX. And I joined the company about 11 years ago as an implementation consultant, where I worked with our clients of colleges and universities to implement our products on the Salesforce platform. Before joining, I spent 16 years at Northwestern University's MBA program. It's the Kellogg School of Management. There, I was the senior associate director. I worked in a dual role as an admissions officer and operations manager. And I helped implement several admissions and application systems. I served as a co-project manager where I represented the business user side while partnering with my IT counterpart. And then prior to that, I spent about another half dozen years or so working in operations and financial services and corporate training and manufacturing. Okay. Yeah. So based on my kind of 27 years here in higher education, I have worked on several dozens of implementation projects. I would say that even to this day, I always learn something new on every project. I always feel like there's some lesson to be learned where I could have done something better, or maybe there was a mistake or a misstep that I could have avoided. So my goal for this presentation is to share all those lessons I've learned over these past 26 years of project management implementations so that you can avoid the mistakes that I've made and hopefully can benefit from some of these lessons I've learned. I will say that there really isn't anything earth-shattering that I'll be sharing with you. I think a lot of this is just common sense. But at least for me, they were the type of lessons where I didn't realize how common sense they were until I realized some of these issues just kind of kept reoccurring. So with that, let's go to the agenda. For today's presentation, we are going to cover the steps needed for a successful implementation from beginning to end. And so to us, that means identifying the preparatory steps you can take before a project starts, identifying the right people to participate, knowing what it actually means to run a project, and then hopefully this will all result in a successful deployment and go live. And if I manage my time well, there'll be time at the end for questions. All right. So these are the steps we're going to cover in more detail today. First, we're going to talk about ensuring that everyone is on the same page regarding the scope of the project. We'll talk about assembling the right mix of people for your project team. I'll share what I think is the ideal combination of skill sets needed for an implementation. We'll talk about finding a project manager with the right skill sets and temperament to lead a team of people and oversee the actual logistics of running a project. We'll talk about the importance of the different types of preparation. And when I say preparation, I mean what you can do to prepare in advance of the project starting and what type of preparation we would expect to see during the course of a project. So when I was at Kellogg, it took a long time from like starting the vendor search to finally signing off on contracts. And had I known then what I know now, I would have made much better use of that time to prepare in advance to allow us to kind of hit the ground running when the project actually started. And then we'll also briefly talk about the type of client-vendor relationship that we at ERX feels conducive to successful implementation. And then we'll wrap up talking about tips for effective training and the importance of change management. So with that, let's start by breaking down the steps with the first step that I feel is often overlooked when it comes to effective project management, and that is to start with a clear project scope that all parties are aware of. One of the biggest rookie mistakes I made as a consultant and project manager, and I mean, truth be told, it was an ongoing mistake for a while, was making a very bad assumption that everybody was on the same page regarding what is the scope of the project. And when I say scope, I mean what is actually part of the project, and in some cases, and more importantly, what is not part of the project. And I learned the hard way that by kind of not addressing this up front from the very beginning, it can unintentionally lead to misunderstanding or a misalignment of expectations. So, for example, there were projects where the client was expecting certain things or certain functionality, which I eventually came to realize had not been discussed during the sales process or wasn't included in the scope of work. I had another situation where certain functionality was discussed. However, the individuals who were involved in that vendor selection process for the school, they intentionally excluded some certain functionality as part of the first phase of the project. They had intended it would be done during a second stage, but that hadn't been communicated back to the entire implementation project team. But I would say that what tends to be the most common scenario is just simply that the project team didn't have the opportunity to see the actual scope of work or discuss the scope with those who negotiated it so that everyone fully understood exactly what the project entails. So to try to avoid those misunderstandings, I would encourage your project team to ask the following questions before you start your project. Who defined the scope of the project on behalf of the school? Who finalized and signed the scope of work with the vendor? There were situations where the business users may have initially defined the scope. They defined what they expect in a project, but what was actually negotiated and signed was actually slightly different. I'd also ask who has the actual copy, and then how can you get a copy to see what are the actual line items of the project. So why is this important? Again, I would say that it's not uncommon to have those who negotiated the project or defined the scope. They are sometimes not the same people who are actively involved in the implementation. And on the flip side, those who are actively involved in the implementation were perhaps not part of the search committee or were not privy to kind of what items were agreed upon as part of that project. All right. So the first two bullets on this slide, they're intended to ensure that at your institution, your vendor selection team and your implementation team are on the same page. The third bullet is to ensure that on the vendor side, or for us in Enrollment RX, that our sales team and our implementation team are also on the same page. And you should expect this from any vendor that you choose to work with for whatever project. So again, when I was at Northwestern, I was actively involved on the selection committee for vendors. I participated in the presentation, the demos, the discussions with the vendor sales team. And I remember that there were a couple of projects that when they started, I was somewhat surprised in that I felt like what had been discussed during the sales process didn't seem to have been clearly communicated to the actual implementation team. So as a result, when I joined Enrollment RX, I was very committed to making sure that our sales team and our implementation team, that we would meet, we would review that scope of work thoroughly, we would review everything that was discussed so that I had the confidence we were implementing what was discussed and agreed upon during that sales process. And the final bullet on the slide is to ensure that your implementation team and the vendor implementation team are also on the same page. So in other words, your team and the vendor team should be in agreement as to what is actually being implemented before the project starts. At least here at Enrollment RX, during my introductory calls, I do try to facilitate these conversations. I'll just flat out ask for that client implementation team, how involved were you with the selection process? How familiar are you with the line items that are included in this project? Have you had an opportunity to see and review a copy of the scope of work? So in summary, I just want to emphasize the importance of just making sure everyone is aligned with expectations, as a first step to having the successful project. Right. So now let's transition from project scope and talk about what I believe is probably one of the most important parts of a successful project, which is finding the right people. When I think back to the most successful implementation projects, one of the key factors was having qualified project team members, both on the client side and vendor side, with balancing skill sets and perspectives. I believe it's extremely beneficial to have people who can think strategically as well as people who can think operationally. So let's talk about the operational perspective first. It is very important to have operations thinking people who understand the day-to-day business processes. These are the individuals who understand all those processes that'll be replaced, from recruitment to application to decision. What keys are being pressed in what system, which spreadsheets are being used that need to go away. They know what data is being manually entered for staff based on different processes. I'd say a common trait, I mean, not to stereotype, but a common trait amongst those who are more operationally minded is that these tend to be the folks who they get things done. They're very satisfied with marking tasks complete. These are the tactical folks who often provide us the requirements we need to build out the project. They think about all the different business scenarios. What about this? What about that? Sometimes they can get lost going down a rabbit hole, maybe obsessing over edge cases. But it is good to have someone who does think about those edge cases, because you don't want to be caught off guard by them coming up after go live for the very first time. And while we absolutely do need client members who not only understand how things are done today, but just as importantly, we need those who also can conceptualize how will things be done tomorrow. And even better, someone who can proactively think about and identify efficiencies and improvements with a brand new system. Finding a person who can fit like all these different bullet points, it's a bonus. It's a blessing if you can find that person. I have worked on projects where we find people who understand everything operationally. They're very knowledgeable. They have a lot of institutional knowledge. More times than not, though, they've been at the university for a very long time. This can be a huge plus for a project, but a potential con is that sometimes these folks who've been there a long time can be very wed to doing things a certain way, because that might be the only way they know how to do things. There were times where we've encountered individuals who were very resistant to change. And as a result, it was challenging for this person to kind of think outside of the box, to adapt to doing things a different way, to make a leap and to think about how can we do it differently or better versus how do we implement this new system to do exactly what we're doing today. So I just want to present this as a cautionary tale where it is, again, important to have someone who knows how things are being done, but ideally it's also someone who has the mindset where they are embracing change and can drive your processes to find those kind of efficiencies. All right, let's talk about your strategic thinkers. You really do need someone, I think, who understands the process well enough to know when to question those processes. So when to ask the questions, why are we doing this today? Do we need to keep doing it? Is there a better way? Your vendor should obviously be asking these questions, but these really are internal conversations that also need to take place, because no one knows your business processes better than you do. Again, common traits I see for those who are more strategically minded, again, stereotyping a little bit, is that they do see things, they see the big picture. And because they see the big picture, these are great folks who are willing to make trade-offs, and they can facilitate those conversations to get the team to make trade-offs. They understand that there might be a few extra keystrokes that have to be entered in one area, but that might be completely offset by a ton of time saved, by like other efficiencies or process changes. I think my favorite strategic thinkers are able to really push back on their team to make them question, do these existing processes make sense? Are they needed? And they also think about scalability. They may recognize that, yes, this process may work for today's volume, but if we grow, will this process make sense going forward? I think these are folks that are also good at understanding that the system can't solve for everything. You don't want to invest too much time and effort trying to automate everything or trying to automate those low volume edge cases. So having those balancing perspectives can be very valuable for facilitating some of these project management conversations. And I would say as a bonus, it is helpful if there's someone on that client team that can work behind the scenes to just constantly assemble the right people at the right time to help remove obstacles, to get ahead of things that might slow down the project. these obstacles might be getting approvals from other parties who are using the system, or winning over some people who are not yet on board with the direction of the project, trying to get the right resources to assist, or maybe to deliver the message that this project might be taking longer than expected. We also find it helpful to have individuals who have strong technical skills, if needed, depending on what is included on your project. So on this slide, I have 3 examples. IT support. So as part of a CRM project, you may need to identify IT support who can assist with the integration from Salesforce to your student information system and then potentially back again. We have some projects where the client does all the integration, which is where having a strong IT client team with adequate time is absolutely essential. We have other clients who've hired Enrollment RX to do integration. We have a service that's called Integration RX. For those who do use Integration RX, this requires less of a lift on the client IT team because we do all the coding. And so as a result, we tend to work more with the business users to identify, what data should be brought over to Banner or Power Campus or and back again. IT support, it's still needed, but not as heavily as when the client is doing the entire integration themselves. Okay? If you're building a new application portal, and if you want it to be, super duper customized, having someone with web development or HTML experience can be very beneficial. However, we have worked with many clients who did not have in-house web development support, so they took advantage of our out-of-the-box portal homepage experience, where you can pick from a library of templates or pick from a library of portal content, which we call, or widgets. So that library of templates, that allows you to easily control the style and the look and feel of the portal. You can choose your school's colors, your fonts, just to ensure that the portal is matching your school's branding. And then when I talked about the widget library, this allows you to customize the content you may want your applicant to see when they register for the portal. So with our application portals, when they register, they'll see a portal homepage with a bunch of blocks or widgets of content. And you can pull this from our library. So you can design the experience where in the upper left-hand corner is a welcome message with a button to fill out the application. The upper right corner has an application checklist. The middle left is a widget to show upcoming events. Middle right is a counselor photo and that contact information for their counselor. Bottom left is an Instagram feed. Bottom right is a series of campus photos. So having this library of content for clients to choose, it reduces the need for a web or HTML expert if one is not available at your institution. And then finally, business user technical skills. It is good to have, a tech-savvy business user who might serve in the role as like your business user system admin. Typically, this person, they're a quick study, they love technology, it's someone who can quickly learn new functionality, who you can trust to maybe make simple changes and updates to any configuration that doesn't require any type of coding, and who might be good at helping to train others. All right. So now let's talk about finding the right project manager. I have frequently been asked, who would we recommend as a project manager? Do you need a certified PPM, like a professional project manager? Can it just be someone who's part of the admissions team or project team? What kind of skill sets does this person need? So while we obviously need someone who can keep things organized, who can make decisions, who can kind of herd cats, I have worked on many projects where just having someone who monitors tasks and deadlines is only a fraction of what is needed to have a successful project. So if you feel that you're implementing a project at your institution, that it might result in competing interests among different parties, then having a project manager, this person also needs decision-making power. So for example, you might have your undergraduate group wants one thing, but the graduate group wants to do it differently. And then you have your MBA program jump in saying, we bring in all the money, so we're still going to do it our way. Then you need a strong PM who can kind of manage this dynamic and make the final decisions if different groups can't agree. Or if your PM doesn't have final decision-making power over these different groups, then they at least need to have the ear of someone higher up who does. Okay. Excuse me.
I'll just say while
Yeah.
Kathy is recovering, she's nursing a cold. So thank you, Kathy, for
You're
all of
just
that.
gonna give me a moment. I'm kind of trying to calm a tickle in my throat. So thank you. All right. Okay, so I've worked on a lot of projects I've mentioned. I have decent number of years of experience, and I have also learned that there are many kind of intangible issues that can also hinder a project more so than missing deadlines or maybe being slow to completing tasks. And this is a list like from my own firsthand experience that I want to present in hopes that you can potentially avoid some of these landmines that aren't always obvious until it becomes obvious, and sometimes maybe a little bit too late in the project. So I kind of touched on this earlier, political issues. I'm sure you're aware, but sometimes in higher ed, there are politics at play at colleges and universities. If this does exist at your school, then it is important, I think, to be mindful of them, anticipate them, and hopefully have someone who can run point on dealing with some of those political sensitivities. Are there difficult people who can sabotage a project? Some people don't like change. Some people don't want change. Some people are aware that their skill sets have fallen behind. They might be fearful that their job will become obsolete. So, if possible, you may want to avoid placing difficult people or negative people in positions where they're influencing others. We've unfortunately had some projects where those in charge did lack some of the qualifications or skill sets or technical prowess or even just the demeanor to successfully run a project. I had a project where those on the project team, they weren't part of the selection process, so they, I think, were feeling some kind of way about that. I recall one project where the project lead, they didn't even want a new CRM system. They felt the existing system was working fine. There was no need for bringing us on board to implement a new system. And unfortunately, those feelings were kind of evident throughout the project. We used to joke that when we would visit every client at the beginning of the project, which is what we do as part of our project, there was typically someone we call the one. And the one is that one person where you can just immediately spot them in the crowd. You can tell they haven't bought into getting a new system for whatever reason. They're clearly not happy. They're not convinced. They don't know why we're there. And I just bring that up because you want to be aware that if there are folks like that, you just want to avoid giving them the ability to perhaps taint the attitude of everyone around them. I've actually seen clients deal with this type of person in two completely different ways. I've had some clients just kind of isolate this type of person from the project as much as possible. They didn't participate in project meetings. Their involvement was at the end where they were trained and either they adapted to the new system or they didn't. But I've also had other clients who took the opposite approach and they chose to get that person very involved behind the scenes. Maybe not in the project meetings, but they were involved in testing the new functionality. They were encouraged to offer feedback for improvement. They were tasked to help train others. And we even had one client where this person who was initially very negative, they actually volunteered to write up documentation to help train the rest of the staff. So whichever approach you use, if you do have like the one, the goal is just to not allow that person to, again, negatively taint the experience for others. Okay. All right, so I've spent a lot of time talking about the people. Let's now talk about tactical tips to just successfully run your project. So first let's talk deadlines. You obviously want to set realistic deadlines, but I think with enough aggressiveness to keep people on their toes and to not give a false sense that there's just plenty of time. Because the longer that project gets drawn out, the greater the chance of project fatigue. It is also very important to leave a buffer for the unexpected because I would say for the majority of my projects, there's always been some unforeseen situation that may have added additional time to the project. That could be due to extra time for approvals, or key personnel were on vacation, or some folks had to take time off due to personal reasons. But I would say like the most common scenario is just that everyone's day job got really, really busy. You have a class to recruit. You still have to keep the lights on. We all know admissions is very cyclical. You have travel season, application submission deadlines, application decision deadlines, open houses, and middays. So it is important to stress, yes, deadlines are important. They need to be met. However, if deadlines are in jeopardy of being met, the team needs to feel comfortable that they can honestly share this without fear of punishment, and that both the client and the vendor can be flexible and work around these issues that may cause potential delays. Because the last thing you want is for your project team to be too scared to truthfully tell you that they're concerned about hitting deadlines, or if they feel they're not ready, you want to have that openness so that you're not caught by surprise upon go live. Okay, now let's talk about some of the internal project management things to be aware of. So when we run our implementation projects, we meet with the client team weekly, but we would also expect the client team to meet on their own internally. And these meetings are very important to ensure that tasks are being done, questions are being raised, business processes are being discussed, new ideas are being generated. So, we encourage you to also plan time for those internal meetings in addition to the project meetings you will have with your vendor. You'll want to identify all the resources who will be part of your project. So they may be pulled in for specific parts of the project at different times. So it is good to make those introductions early, get on their calendar, so because you want to ensure that outside parties have the bandwidth to assist with your project if they also have other responsibilities or other projects that they're working on. Adapt. I would say for the project managers or the project leads, you should be prepared to play a lot of roles and wear different hats. It's good to have a person who's comfortable doing this. I have listed here different roles you might be playing. It could be taskmaster, motivator, moderator, collaborator. Sometimes you're negotiating things. Sometimes you're serving as a therapist for people if they're feeling stressed. And sometimes you might be playing the good cop or the bad cop. And then finally, you'll also want to have a plan for change management. So how will you roll out changes? Who will be communicating those changes? What goals of the project do you wish to communicate to outside parties? What is the feedback loop? Who will be checking in on all those parties involved, and how will you analyze the results? Okay. So timeline. Whoever you ultimately decide to work with as your partner, you will want to get a detailed timeline so that you can coordinate your resources and ensure that they'll be available when needed for their particular part of the project. This timeline, this is an example of a more high-level timeline for an Enrollment RX project where we try to break out what happens when so the client can ensure they can assemble the right people. Once our projects begin, we also provide a much more detailed and customized project plan, kind of like week by week. But this is to just give you an idea of how to break up our projects kind of on a loose timeline. So first, we'll spend the first several weeks in the discovery phase. We'll review and discuss current business processes. We'll work on collecting requirements. We'll also then transition and spend some time discussing your integration plans. If you'll be doing all the integration yourself, then we may offer a few hours of advisory services to kind of help your team get started and get on their way. We'll also talk about the type of data that eventually be needed for data migration. And we want to discuss it early so that we can give your IT team plenty of time to kind of plan for this and get this again on their docket. We'll spend the majority of our time doing the actual Salesforce setup and configuration. And again, if you choose Enrollment RX as your vendor, we'll also do all our Enrollment RX product configurations. If, as part of your project, you purchase an email marketing tool, such as Marketing Cloud as one example, you'll also want to work that into your timeline as well. We will provide some Salesforce administrative configuration and Salesforce admin remote training. If you were to use, again, our integration RX services, then we also will be running a separate project plan in tandem with the implementation project. So those will run concurrently. And then we'll wrap things up by coming on site for training and then hopefully get you going on your go live plan. And this slide, this is just a more simplified visual. And here we're just bucketing the project stages into 3 phases where it's discovery, then configuration, and then wrapping up with training. All right. And finally, let's talk about the importance of setting the tone. I really can't emphasize enough how important it is to have your project manager or client team, as well as your vendor team, comprised of champions, cheerleaders, very positive advocates for the project. The best led projects I felt were run by a client project manager who's positive. Again, they're setting that tone. They promote a very safe environment for team members to honestly express concerns, honestly share when there's going to be potential delays. They don't try to assess blame on others, including your vendor, and which leads to my next slide, where I would like to talk about the importance of that vendor relationship. So what are the signs that you are on your way to having a successful vendor relationship? We believe that for the vendor should be constantly communicating timelines with you. There should be clear tasks, clear requirements, deliverables, and deadlines. They should be communicating with you also about what is their project methodology, and you should be comfortable with the timelines and methodology. And if you're not, you should feel comfortable sharing your concerns to work towards a resolution. The vendor should also be asking for your feedback on the progress of the project. Here we are constantly asking our clients for feedback. Should we be doing things differently? Do we need to adjust deadlines? Do we need to pivot, maybe change the order in which we're tackling the project due to conflicting resources? Should we be more gentle? Should we be more aggressive? We want to know how you as a client are feeling. What issues do we need to be mindful of that maybe we're not catching, or maybe it's just not as obvious during our project meetings? What can we be doing differently or better? And hopefully this, type of sincere, this honest communication will lead to, a meaningful long-term partnership. I really do believe that these projects can be and should be fun. These projects, they can be stressful. They are time consuming. It's a lot of additional work on top of their day job. So even when I was at Kellogg, I always believed, my personal philosophy, that to spend so much of your working day not having fun, like that is a missed opportunity. We really do strive to have that positive, long-lasting relationship. And I believe that the stronger the relationship, the greater is our ability to pivot as needed throughout the course of the project. So, whether you work with us or other partners, don't underestimate the value of establishing that strong partnership. Okay. And now let's talk about specific tactical things you can be reviewing and preparing in advance of the selection of your new system or vendor. So once your institution has committed that you are going to get a new system, here are some things that you can begin doing even before you select your vendor. So one, look for opportunities to standardize. Find all those secret spreadsheets, begin identifying all the business processes that are being recorded or managed outside of an actual system. Review business processes across different groups, such as undergrad, grad, PhD, etc., and see, are there opportunities to standardize how you do things while still allowing for the flexibility to accommodate that which is truly unique for each program. Use this as an opportunity to review and assess all your external forms, such as your request for information forms, your application, event registration forms, anything that's front-facing that you want to replace as part of this project. And as you assess each of those forms, ask yourself, is this form too long? Are we asking questions where we're not even doing anything with the data? And if the answer is yes, then you might want to consider just removing the questions. I'm sure you're all aware that there is definitely a trend to keep these external forms as short or as simple as possible, knowing that, the attention span of high school students is getting shorter, and they just have, I think, a lower willingness or tolerance to fill out questions that they feel like it's not necessary. There's also an opportunity for you to standardize the type of questions you ask and the pick list or drop-down options that can be selected on your forms. So we've had, several clients where each group or each department, they were creating their own inquiry forms. And therefore, each group was kind of asking the same question, maybe, but they were phrasing it in different ways, or maybe they were just collecting different responses. So one example was we had at a school, one group was asking for gender, but their responses were male, female, prefer not to say. Another group was collecting male, female, and other. One group labeled the question as a gender, another group labeled it as sex. Citizenship was another question that was being asked with different responses offered on the form. And even the way they asked for military background was also different. So these are just examples of, you can take, just a simple step of reviewing the forms, see if you can simplify and see if you can standardize. It'll save time if you can do this in advance while you're waiting for that selection process to take place versus, doing that when the project starts. On the flip side, however, even though I'm advocating for you to keep your forms short and simple, you should review them and ask yourself if you want to add new questions that'll help your business process on the back end. Will new questions actually save time? Will they add efficiency to the point where it's worth asking those extra questions? So, for example, on the inquiry forms, we've had schools make the zip code of their mailing address required so that the school could then immediately assign a counselor since ownership was based on zip code. Other schools on the back end in Salesforce, we added like a zip code to county table. So whereby when the candidate entered the zip code, we could then find the county and then the counselor was immediately assigned because that school did assignments based on in-state county. Other schools have used our forms to access like a high school table that we stored in Salesforce. And this allowed for an immediate assignment to a counselor because in their situation, counselors were assigned based on high school. And here, for our form, the applicant didn't have to remember what is their zip code to then select the school. They could just start typing the name of the school. And because our form was then directly accessing that Salesforce table of schools, as they were typing, our forms would then return a list of schools to match what they were doing in their type ahead field. Let's talk about the application. When it comes to the application, we've had schools ask additional questions, again, for the purpose of facilitating back-end business processes. Like, is family employed by the university? Has the applicant ever applied before? Asking these type of questions, it allowed us to create automatic waivers for the application fee. Or if someone had applied before, we could generate a completely different set of checklist requirement items that are needed versus someone who's applying for the first time. Some clients use the new application to ask better residency questions to kind of streamline that process on the back end. Review all your business processes. So I, just talked about reviewing your business processes to identify ways to standardize. I would also encourage you to review all the steps that your staff performs to document areas where it might be an opportunity to automate. So again, with our functionality, we can automate the type of checklist requirements or application items that are generated and that display to the applicant in the portal. We can customize things at a very granular level. So that means your staff doesn't have to manually add or manually delete specific items for some of those exception cases. We can automatically waive application fees. If included in the project scope, we've actually built something to help the clients automate their admit and deny decisions. For those of us those who've used our integration RX services, our team has been able to automate some processes that took place with data flowing between Salesforce and their SIS. The process for leasing holds is a recent example that came to mind where we're actually able to automate that process. So how do you get to the point where you can standardize the processes or streamline or automate? You might want to perform some type of audit for each of your functional positions. So learn more about how does your staff perform their job. And as I've bulleted here, identify, is there redundancy? Are there opportunities to automate? Are there secret spreadsheets you can eliminate? It's also helpful to assess how is the staff feeling about the implementation of a new project. I think this falls into the category of trying to get ahead of the whole change management process because you should be mindful of how the thought of a new project can impact your team's attitude and potentially their stress levels. Think about how you're presenting this new project, but how that message might be interpreted by your staff. So, on this call, I'm sure most of us think that automation and standardization and finding efficiencies are very positive things, but your staff might be hearing that their job is at risk or could be eliminated. So even though you might be trying to do an audit to try to make their lives better, they may be very protective or concerned or even unwilling to fully share what they do because they may feel they're giving you reasons to eliminate their job. Okay? This slide also illustrates things that you can prepare in advance that may impact groups outside of admissions. So you may need to get buy-in from others outside of the group or begin taking steps to coordinate some of these efforts. So one example is communications. Oftentimes when a client starts a new implementation project, it often goes hand in hand with reviewing all their prints and email and text communications. And you may wish to compile like an inventory of existing communications and be working on, what is our new communication plan going forward? When it comes to IT, this is a good opportunity to, again, begin working on cleaning up any data that will be migrated from your SIS to Salesforce. Examples would include maybe your academic program tables, your majors, your terms, your high school table, your college table. I would say the vast majority of our projects, it typically requires the IT team to do some type of audit or some cleanup of data before they export it from their SIS and import it to Salesforce. Because the data that you eventually report on in Salesforce, it's only going to be good as the data that was initially brought in. And web development. As I mentioned earlier, with our Enrollment RX projects, you have the opportunity, to build a customized application portal homepage experience. So again, when someone registers to fill out the application, they're presented with this homepage of content. And that content, it may change as their application changes. So you could have content specific to when they start their application. Then that content can change once they submit their application. And then the content can change again once they're admitted. And so this is an example where your team can begin thinking about what type of content you want to present and perhaps start storyboarding in advance what you would like to kind of showcase or market to your applicants. All right, so now we're in the final stretch. We're now jumping to the final stages of the project, which is the actual deployment project. So let's assume it's 4 to 6 months later, you've configured everything in Sandbox, which is your test environment. You've tested, you validated, you're ready for go live. The next step is to take everything that was built in Sandbox and move everything into your Salesforce production environment or the live environment. So what is actually moved and how is that done? Change sets. First of all, many things that are configured in Salesforce, it will be moved over using standard Salesforce functionality called change sets. And change sets in Salesforce, they're just like groups of components that are being deployed from one sales fork to another. So in this case, from Sandbox to production. This is an out-of-the-box deployment user interface provided by Salesforce, and it allows us to send those customizations from Sandbox to production. For those of you more technically minded, this is like how we move what they call metadata, which is like data that describes data. So the way the records behave or the way your org looks, the look and feel. If we happen to build anything using code, which we rarely don't do, we will deploy that via change sets as well. Record migration. We also will be bringing over 3 types of actual data or records of data. The first type of records we bring over are your reference records that will live in specific reference tables in Salesforce. So examples, as I mentioned before, it's your table of programs, majors, terms, high schools, colleges. Also, many of our Enrollment RX products that we configure, they're brought over to production, not by the Salesforce change sets, but we will migrate what we call configuration records. And then the final type of records that we'll bring over are transaction records. And this is your actual live data records that are being extracted from your current systems, sometimes spreadsheets, and we will bring those into Salesforce. So these include your inquiries. These are your applicants who have applied in your old system and who will be interacting with your new system in Salesforce. And in many cases, we will bring over several years of historical data. All right. So now that you know what deployment and data migration entails, who is responsible for what? We've had many clients kind of express concerns about this end process of deployment. They want to know whether or not they have the right people with the skill sets to handle this deployment. So the good news is that, at least for our projects, we handle the deployment. Based on the bullets in this box, you can see that we handle all the deployment items that I just discussed. We'll use the Salesforce out-of-the-box interface to deploy the change sets, to get those configurations from sandbox to production. We'll migrate our ERX production or configuration records so that our products look the way they do and do the things they're supposed to do. We'll migrate your reference tables and we'll migrate your live data. What does the client need to do? First, basically, we'll just ask you, create all your staff users in production. You would provide to us those reference files and those transaction files for us to do the import. And since we typically do data migration over the weekend before you go live, we would just request that your staff be available over the weekend to assist with troubleshooting, like in case maybe we get errors when trying to load a data file. And then once everything's brought over, you might wish to have your staff test and validate the functionality over the weekend, or you just may choose to wait until Monday for that. And then last but not least is the importance of ongoing training. We believe this should be an ongoing exercise. If possible, it's great if you can try to allocate some time for Salesforce self-study. If you are, if we're your partner in crime in a project, we also have lots of videos and materials to learn about our product offerings and how to configure. We suggest you may want to consider maybe methodically or continuously introducing your staff to parts of the project throughout the implementation, as opposed to saving everything until the end. This might allow them to feel more engaged, perhaps maybe less anxious about the project. But, to be honest, we've had many schools who've taken that opposite approach. They felt it was better to wait until the end when everything is done so that they can show a more finished project versus showing things that are incomplete, which they feel might cause more anxiety or maybe more confusion. And then we also do encourage you to have ongoing meetings after Enrollment, if we're your partner, after Enrollment RX conducts our on-site training. These meetings should have the goal to train and work in the system together so that the information stays fresh and it's not forgotten between the time when they were trained till your actual go live date. And just so you're aware, for our clients and when it does come time for training, we really do have a phenomenal site that we call the RAD Navigator. It's a wonderful resource that contains everything a client needs to know about our products. We have a ton of trading videos. We have recordings of all our webinars. We have detailed product guides. It really is a valuable training resource for our clients. Okay. So with that, we are now at the end of the formal presentation. I think I did an okay job managing time, as we do have some time for questions.
Thank you, Kathy. Yes, we do. And let's see if we have any questions in the question box. And we do here, Kath. So this is a good question. It's a two-part question, really. Are there any factors, it says, that would cause a project to take longer? And then the second part is, are there any factors that might cause a project to go more quickly?
Sure. So let's start out with the ones that go quickly. I would say that those projects, they tend in general to be, I would say, more simple. They're more straightforward. So also you might have a team that is, has the time to be devoted to the project. They know existing processes very well, and as a result, they're able to very quickly turn around requirements for us. So having that quick turnaround time certainly facilitates a faster moving project. I would say another factor is if the project team has that decision-making authority, so they don't have to spend a lot of that extra time consulting with other, I would say, it's a team that has time to work on it. They're able to facilitate, I think, faster turnaround of tasks because they might have that decision-making authority to be able to quickly identify requirements, document them, provide it to us. They don't have to spend a lot of time consulting with other parties. Sometimes timing just comes into play. Sometimes that project takes place like right during a client's downtime or their slow time. So that facilitates a quicker project. I think if the team members, just organized, they're very familiar with their systems. And I would also say if they're quick with testing and validating and sign off. So I think those are things I've seen to facilitate like a quicker project. For those where maybe it took longer than expected, again, those typically, I think opposite of what I said earlier, those projects are typically more complex. It oftentimes involves more collaboration with outside parties. There are more players involved, so more voices need to be heard, longer time it takes for decisions to be made. Sometimes tasks and decisions, it kind of goes death by committee. Everything has to be discussed before things can move forward. And again, maybe the testing and validation was a slower process and resources just weren't as available.
Yeah, fantastic. There's one more question here, Kath, which is, can you describe training in more detail? So I think there's a lot that we can unpack in a question like that, but yeah, can you maybe just give more insight into the training?
Sure. So at least for Enrollment RX, we do both remote training and we do on-site training. So first, like we actually come on site at the beginning of a project. We actually, even before training, we do what we call a business process review. It's like a discovery session on how things are done today. And that's like a day and a half. But when it comes to training throughout the course of the project, we'll do at least 3 hours of remote Salesforce admin training. We do many more hours of remote Enrollment RX product training. And then at the end of the project, we will actually come on site anywhere from 3 to 4.5 days. It's depending on the size of the client staff. And we will do on-site general user training in addition to a full day of system admin training. That's typically how we run things on our side.
Excellent. All right. Well, that seems to be all the questions I think we have. So with that, I do want to thank everybody for attending for all of these 9 webinars. They are recorded. They are available on our website at enrollmentrx.com. Please check them out there or on our YouTube channel. And thank you as well, Kathy, to you for your participation today. And let me also thank Audrey Sutherland, who has been coordinating all of these throughout and is as a silent party to all of these calls. So thank you so much as well, Audrey, for all of your efforts and participation. And again, thank you all for attending, and we hope to see you on the next series. Thanks, Kath.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.